homework problem from one of my undergraduates. A young woman pointed out that we have a metaphor. By the way, I'm the guy who figured out how metaphorical thought works and what the math behind that is. It's my job. Okay? It's my day job. And so I said, okay. She pointed out we have a metaphor that the nation is a family. We have founding fathers, we send our sons and daughters to war, we have homeland security, and so on and so on. And I said, okay, if we have this metaphor about the nation, if we have two different views of the nation, maybe they're based on two different views of the family. So I set up the metaphors mathematically and worked backwards, right? A standard tradition in science. We all work backwards. That's actually how science gets done. It's reverse engineering. And out popped two different views of the family. A strict father view and a nurturing parent view. Amen. And you know which is which. And I went off, I will go through that in some detail, but I went off to a conference of cognitive linguists. There were 500 cognitive linguists in a single room in New Mexico. And way up in the corner, there were two guys who were talking to each other throughout my talk, who were whispering, who were old friends of mine. They were members of the Christian Coalition. I have friends who are members of the Christian Coalition. They're Bible translators who are terrific linguists and very nice folks. And so afterwards, when we were having a party and I was drinking a beer and they weren't, I went up and said hello, and they said, hey, you know what about this strict father stuff you said? It's sort of right. We have to correct a couple of details here and there. You know, it's there, but you got to get it. We want you to get it right. But you should know all this. Don't you read Dobson? Well, this is 1995. I'm saying, who's Dobson? And they say, you must live in Berkeley. James Dobson, he's on more radio shows than more radio stations than anyone else and more newspapers than anyone else. He's got so many people writing for his materials, he needs his own zip code. And he hires so many people, he's got his own freeway exit. Okay? And one of my students, when I mentioned this, signed me up for 3 years of his materials. Now, they said, you should really go and read his classic book, Dare to Discipline. Okay? I said, oh, great, where do I find this? In your local Christian bookstore, they said. I said, well, I live in Berkeley. They said, even in Berkeley, walk down Telegraph Avenue, cross White Way, turn right, and you will see the Jews for Jesus bookstore. Oh. So when I got back, I put on my dark glasses and my trench coat in midsummer, walked down into the Jews for Jesus bookstore carrying a brown bag, so I had a plain brown wrapper. And there in the back shelf was the new Dare to Discipline and lots of other conservative child-rearing books, all of which spelled out in detail the strict father family. And Dobson spelled out not only the parenting model, but all the applications to politics and foreign policy and economics and religion and everything else. He had it all written down there. I had figured it out. It took me months and months to figure this stuff out, and he had already figured it out for the conservatives. And other conservatives had figured it out. Now, what's interesting about this is the following, and it goes like this. In a strict father family, the father is the leader of the family, the boss, the major authority. There's no authority over the father in the family. The father knows right from wrong. And the assumption is kids are born bad in the following sense, that they don't know right from wrong yet, that they just do what feels good. You've heard the term feel-good liberalism? What that means to conservatives is liberals have not been taught right. They haven't been taught the right morality by their parents. They haven't been punished when they did things wrong. They've just been allowed to do what feels good. So you can't allow that. Strict father family father has to punish his child lovingly, because that's called tough love, often physically, so that the child will learn to do what the father says, which is always correct and right, and learn morality and not do bad things, not just do what feels good. Then they will learn discipline, and there's a logic to that, which is if you learn discipline, then you can go out into a free market world, get fiscal discipline, and they become prosperous. So, what happens if someone's not prosperous? Guess why?
Their own fault.
They have no discipline. Well, then they can't be moral, so they deserve their poverty. But maybe they should be taught a lesson, right? To have everything taken away so that they will get more discipline, right? That's why, because they deserve punishment. Got it? You've heard this argument directly out of this, and you hear it over and over from your governor and lots of other folks, most recently from Paul Ryan this week. Now, there are other parts of the strict father family structure that's they're very important. One of them says, of course, there should be no authority higher than the father. You'll see that that's very important in many cases. So that the authority must be maintained at all costs. Secondly, there's an assumption that this is natural and right and moral. That the father is naturally the leader of the family, being male, and that this is a moral thing to do because he knows right from wrong and is teaching his kids morality, making sure that the family does things right. So it's a moral thing to do. And that assumes that power and morality should fit together. That the people who rule should be the most moral people. Well, how do you know? Well, in a well-ordered world, ordered by God, there's a hierarchy. Okay? You look at what has happened. You have God above man, man above nature. Nature is there for you to use any way you want, right? So man above nature, adults above children. Children are there to be, beaten if necessary and raised properly and corrected and so on and tested and so on. So there are, adults above children. Western culture above non-Western culture. Our country above other countries. And most conservatives will buy that much. And then the hierarchy goes further, which is not true of all conservatives, but many. You have men above women, Christians above non-Christians, straights above gays, whites above non-whites. That is, all of those things are part of the same hierarchy. There's a reason for all those things fitting together. Now, what I did when I wrote Moral Politics back in '96 as a result of this was to point out that all of those positions of conservatives make sense. And when I had to do my view of this, I said, how do mine fit together? That was based on what I'll call a nurturing parent family, which is actually, by the way, when I got into this, I went over to the Institute for Human Development at Berkeley, which studies parenting and child development, and found out that these family structures had been discovered and discussed in great detail. And we can talk about that. I talked about that in Moral Politics. This is not something that just happened to come out in my research. People who did the research had found the same things. Now, the nurturing parent family goes like this. It says, if you have two parents, they have equal authority. And their job is to empathize with their children, to notice what their children need, to fit in their shoes, to see, if they're crying, why they're crying, what this is about. And their job is to maintain two-way communication. It's not, shut up and listen. It's tell me what's going on, and I'm going to tell you what's going on. If I have to protect my child, I have to tell them why I'm doing it. I don't just say, do it, period. Right? So you explain it first. Then, in addition to that, Your job is to nurture your child to be fulfilled and to be able to take care of themselves and others. That is, personal responsibility and social responsibility go together there. You raise your child to be responsible to their family, to their community, to their country, and for themselves at the same time. And you raise them to be fulfilled maximally in their lives. That's what a nurturing parent does. They're very different. Now, Barack Obama in 2008 understood this very well. And these ideas actually showed up in his speeches in 2008. And if you want to see the best example of this, you can go to a speech that is almost never cited in the press. It's his Father's Day speech in 2008, where he's talking to an African-American church in Chicago about and addressing young men who have fathered children and are not raising them. And he says, you're not a real man if you're doing that. A real man takes responsibility for his family and for others and for people in his community. You want to be a man, you have to be responsible. Go and join your family, but you're not in charge, because the mother of those children know better than you do, because they've been raising them. Your job is to empathize with them, take care of them, make sure that they care about others, because if you're not teaching empathy, then you're going to get a generation of people who don't care about each other, because you can't have that. And the other thing you need is to acquire a sense of quality, of an ethic of excellence is what he called it. That is, you want to raise your children to be the best they can to be fulfilled in their lives. And you want to do the same. Start doing it yourself. Okay? And then he said, government works exactly the same way. And he spelled it out. Look up, great speech. Now, he didn't continue that in many cases. He continued talking about empathy. He has over 80 speeches on that, and if you go to a website called The Culture of Empathy, you'll see those speeches. They're out there. When did Obama stop talking about empathy? During the Sotomayor nomination case, when he said a Supreme Court justice requires empathy. And he was jumped on by conservatives who didn't know what empathy was. They thought he meant sympathy. They thought he meant, you should be favoring other people. And so, because that was misunderstood, instead of coming out the next day and saying, no, I meant empathy, and here's what empathy is, and here's why it should be in every Supreme Court justice, he stopped. Because he was attacked. And he's done that a number of times, which is a terrible shame. Yes. Now, these differences in family models turn out to be applied in every area of life. And I have a book on that called Whose Freedom? Inspired by George W. Bush. In his second inaugural address, he used the words free, freedom, and liberty 49 times in 20 minutes. And more than half of those were not anything I would recognize as freedom at all. And the reason was he has a strict father view, and freedom is a contested concept. It means something different to conservatives and liberals. And conservatives are taking over the words freedom and liberty constantly. And what I'm going to be arguing and talking about is it's time to take them back. Freedom is important. It's central in democracy, and we can take it back, and it's central to every issue that is going on in this state. So there's a reason for a Wisconsin Freedom Campaign. We'll go into those reasons in detail. But very, very important to see that. Now, when you understand one more thing, let me ask you a question. When were you first governed? In your family. Right? You learned that a governing institution is a family. You learned it in your brains. That's how metaphors are formed very early. And then that gets applied to all governing institutions, whether they're churches, classrooms, teams, or political parties, or the government. It gets applied throughout, including institutions like the market. And I want to talk about that next. There's a reason why conservatives and progressives think absolutely differently about the market. And it goes like this. You've heard the expression, let the market decide. Right? I'm a linguist, I say, okay, the verb decide usually takes a subject that is not the market. It's usually an animate subject. A decider, as George Bush famously said. Well, why is the market a decider? What does that mean? The market is seen as being like the strict father, natural on the assumption that all people are naturally greedy, moral on the conservative assumption of the invisible hand metaphor, that is, if everybody pursues their own profit, the profit of all will be maximized, and that's moral. That's the conservative version of Adam Smith. And then it's assumed that the market is going to reward those with fiscal discipline and punish those without it. But most important is there should be no authority higher than the market. The market's the strict father, no authority higher. What does that mean? It means no government regulation, no taxation, no worker rights, no unions, no tort cases, and no view of science that contradicts the market. Okay? Think of what this explains. All of those things fit together. They make sense to conservatives to have those positions. They're the same position. They're not different positions for conservatives. And that's important to understand. And there is a progressive view of the market that's very different. It says, businesses are fine. If you want to start a bakery and bake good bread, wonderful. We have good bread out in Wisconsin these days. You want to make good cheeses? Fantastic. You want to make a living making good cheeses? Wonderful, because good cheeses are good for people. Good beer, better beer the better. Terrific, great. That's wonderful. Do things that are responsible to the public, that make life better for people, and allow you to live, and not only that, any money you spend, we help other people, who are in business, and most people, are in business doing something or other, unless they're working for the state. If they're working for the state, they're working for everybody. So the question is, how do people help everybody? That's a very different view of the market. And it says, how are people going to be protected in these cases, where you do have to have, regulation and taxation and all those things. So, very, very different view of the market and of everything else. Now, that says something important, that issues fit together. They're not separate. They come together around these moral worldviews. Now, a few little linguistic facts. One of the first things I learned when I started teaching about framing was that if you negate a frame, you activate the frame. Right? You reinforce the frame. How? Okay? Richard Nixon said, "I am not a crook." Made you think of him as a crook. I wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, for just that